Okay, I am back, and this is for all the Scott Peterson people who are still waiting for me to conclude my video series. And this is the very end. I'm going to do probably a few more videos here that's going to wrap up everything I have been researching for the past month and a half. Now, I set out, when I began this series, I set out to say, I'm not here to prove that someone is innocent or someone is guilty. That's not what this is about. I'm curious about the quality of the trial. I firmly believe that you're innocent until proven guilty. And I wanted to look at this case to see if the prosecution actually would have convinced me. If I was on a jury, would they have convinced me beyond reasonable doubt Scott Peterson killed his wife and unborn child? Now, you've come into the comments and asked, well, who do I think did it? And what's it? I don't know any of that. That wasn't the mission of this video series. The mission of this video series was to say, let's look at the evidence again. And are there places and pockets where I have questions? So after almost 40 videos, I'm going to tell you, I got a lot of questions. And it would have been very hard for me as a juror to convict him because I do not believe that the state made their case. He might very well have done it, but the evidence that they presented and the way they presented it, I am not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. So this final series of videos is really just meant to be kind of my closing arguments. In summation, here's what I think. So as a recap, I'm going to go back through just some critical things that I have found that I think were important to wrap this up with. You can tune in, you don't have to tune in. I'm not trying to woo anybody to either side. I'm just simply saying at the end of all of this research, here's what I've concluded. We've talked a lot about motive. There were really three main motives that the police and the state were working toward. The big one was his affair with Amber Frey, that somehow his obsession or his fascination with Amber Frey somehow made him decide that he was going to murder his wife. Okay, that's motive number one. Motive number two was financial. They were in some sort of financial dire straits, that Lacey had a champagne taste with Scott's, Busch Light budget, and that he had great financial stress and that there was financial motivation behind killing her. The third one, and this is one that a lot of people keep coming into the comments to suggest as well, is that Scott never wanted a baby. So having done a lot of research, reading through a lot of the testimony, reading through a lot of the court documents, I feel like all three of those motives have been debunked. But let me go back through some things just to close my case. Now, let's remember from the very beginning, just a few minutes into the police being at Scott Peterson's home on the night of 12/24, they assumed that he had done something. And in the first 10 minutes, they had called in the homicide detectives because they felt that there was something going on with this man. There was concerns about Scott's behavior that first evening. So some of the police reported that he was too emotional, that it felt staged and acted like he was overacting, being sad and distraught, and that it was too much. There were others that said he was too calm, that he wasn't acting like a husband should act if his wife is missing. The police said that Scott failed to be able to tell them when they asked what type of fish he was fishing for. He couldn't name the type of fish. That Scott had just insisted to the police that he really wasn't in the marina that day for any, necessarily to fish. He just wanted to get the boat into the water, and they found that that was a little bit suspicious. Scott allowed the police into his home without warrants on that first night to do multiple searches. In fact, he allowed 4 walkthroughs of his house and 1 of his warehouse on that first evening that Lacey was missing. Scott said that night at the police station that he was willing to take a polygraph test. And I'm going to read, you've seen the video of the video recording of Scott being questioned that night at the police station by Detective Brocchini, but I'm going to read the transcript here. Brocchini says, just to eliminate you as a suspect, are you willing to take a polygraph? Scott says, yes, they're accurate, right? And Brocchini says, yeah. I mean, it's nothing that can be used against you, but yeah, I believe they're accurate. So Scott says, yeah, I'm certainly willing. Now, his father later talked him out of it because the father said, listen, you've got an alibi. In fact, they checked every aspect of Scott's alibi, and there wasn't one part of Scott's alibi that they could poke holes in. Every single place he said he was, every single thing that he said happened that day actually happened. So his father says, you've got an alibi, everything's checking out, you didn't do anything, so why should you have to take a polygraph test? Now, I know there's a lot of you that say failure to take a polygraph test is like an admission of guilt. Also, a lot of you have been coming into my comments asking me to cover other cases. And one of the names that someone gave me, I thought, I've never heard of this guy. I looked him up, I Googled him, and it turns out he is somebody who's been sitting in jail for like 50 years for a crime he might not have committed. And he took six polygraph tests, and he passed all of them. And he still got convicted. So no one can tell me that a polygraph test, if Scott had taken one and passed one, if Scott took one today and passed one, no one would believe him. They would just say, well, he passed the polygraph, but, he's just a really good liar. So it's damned if you do and damned if you don't when it comes to polygraphs. So he chose not to take one. He took his father's advice. Would I have taken one? I don't know. With the way that some of these cases are investigated by police, I don't know that I would trust them to take one either. Now, the state's theory is that Scott strangled or suffocated Laci in their home on either the 23rd or the 24th of December. They said that he then wrapped her body in a blue tarp, put her into his truck, and transported her to the warehouse. They say that at the warehouse, he unwrapped her from the tarp. He put her into the boat and then used the canvas boat cover to conceal that she was in the boat as he drove her to the marina. But it turns out that there was no evidence that he ever killed her in the home, and there's no evidence that he ever transported her body. Every single test that was conducted by local police, forensics teams, the FBI, the California Department of Justice, millions of dollars were spent. Every single test came back negative. There was nothing on the tarp. There was nothing on the boat cover. There was nothing in the truck. There was nothing in the boat. And to be very honest with you, after 30 plus days of searching the bay with the most sophisticated dive teams, sonar detection that was available at the time, there was never any evidence that Laci and Connor were ever in that bay. I know they've washed up on shore, and there's a lot of evidence that sea life and things like that got to Laci's body. But when they searched that water repeatedly, they never found any evidence. No cement anchors, no clothing, no duct tape, no hair, no body parts, nothing from either Laci or Connor that they were ever in that water. No eyewitnesses ever saw Scott committing the crime. There was no evidence that those pliers, they ran tests on those pliers that were found in the boat, the plier that had a hair wrapped around the end of them. There were tests run. There's no evidence that those pliers had recently been used in any manner at all. They had search dogs and cadaver dogs roam the areas, and all of their results were inconclusive. In fact, they were heard in preliminary hearings, but not allowed into the actual trial. The cadaver dogs found no indication of Laci's dead body in the house, in the truck, in the boat, or in the warehouse. So there is no incriminating evidence at all at any of the places that the police described as being the crime scenes. The state said that Laci and Connor washed ashore, but yet their own expert couldn't trace them back to that same place. There isn't evidence that shows that Laci was ever in the water at the same place where Scott had been fishing. And again, no anchors or other evidence were ever found. There's more to cover. Please keep coming back for additional videos.